Elon Musk had grown accustomed to the relentless rhythm of his life, but Europe, this time, bore down on him with a peculiar weight. His tour stretched from gilded halls in Vienna to austere conference rooms in Berlin, each day stacked meticulously with business forums, banquets, and press engagements that left little space to breathe. His team orchestrated every moment, each handshake, each carefully measured smile, each reply calculated to preserve the pristine image the world demanded of him. Yet it was Paris that pressed on him the heaviest, like a velvet curtain slowly suffocating. Beneath the shimmering chandeliers of the Palais Garnier, amidst the murmur of dignitaries and the crisp pop of champagne bottles, Elon realized how detached he had become from himself, from life, from the untamed spaces where spontaneity used to live. The more polished the stage, the more hollow it all felt. His team hovered incessantly, shepherding him from gallery openings to formal dinners, their schedules pinned to him like armor. There were no accidental moments anymore. No lingering strolls. No conversations without purpose. A quiet rebellion smoldered inside him. It wasn't one event that broke him. It was the slow erosion of his freedom, the way each minute was accounted for, the way his own breathing seemed to require permission. That night, after enduring another suffocating reception, Elon retreated to his hotel room. The thick curtains, the carved moldings, the distant hum of the city, it should have comforted him. Instead, it magnified his isolation. His doctor, a well-meaning but clinical man, handed him a small white pill. "Just something to help you rest," he murmured, concerned by Elon's spiraling tension. Elon took it out of habit, not conviction. But rest did not come. His chest ached with a yearning he hadn't dared to name, an aching desire to step outside the lines of his carefully drawn life. To breathe air unscripted, to speak words unapproved, to exist, if only for an hour, without the crushing gaze of the world upon him. Without warning, something inside him snapped. It was not rage. It was not fear. It was a sudden, undeniable pull toward freedom. His staff was momentarily preoccupied, consumed by emails, press releases, security checks. Elon seized the sliver of time, like a man grabbing a final breath before sinking. He slipped out through the service entrance, the weight of duty peeling from his shoulders with each hurried step. The cold air hit his face, sharp and exhilarating. For the first time in years, he walked not as Elon Musk, the icon, but as Elon, a man with no itinerary. The streets of Paris pulsed with life. Street musicians played delicate melodies that chased him around corners. Vendors called out in lilting French. Lovers laughed, their joy effortless and unguarded. His senses, long dulled by routine, drank it all in greedily. The scent of fresh bread wafting from a nearby bakery, the uneven rhythm of footsteps on cobblestone, the dizzying swirl of lights reflected in puddles from an earlier rain. It was intoxicating. And yet, beneath his newfound freedom, the sedative quietly advanced through his bloodstream. His body grew heavy, his steps uncertain. His vision blurred, and the sounds of the city folded into a distant echo. Disoriented, Elon stumbled into a small square and lowered himself onto a wooden bench. The world tilted around him as if the sky itself had grown too weary to stand. His eyelids, betraying him, drifted closed. He did not see Claire Benton approach. Claire, a journalist with a practiced eye for stories hidden in plain sight, had not intended to walk through the square that evening. But chance, perhaps something gentler, guided her path. She noticed him at once, a man in an expensive suit, crumpled like forgotten linen, his breathing slow but steady. Something in the vulnerable curve of his shoulders struck her, a quiet unraveling that did not belong to the usual parade of tourists. She hesitated, unsure whether to intervene. But as she drew closer, a flicker of recognition caught in her chest. It couldn't be. "Sir," she whispered, gently touching his shoulder. Elon stirred faintly, his words a soft tangle. "Just let me stay here, just a little longer." His accent, his face, there was no doubt now. But this was not the man from glossy headlines or stoic interviews. This was someone unraveling, drifting somewhere between exhaustion and surrender. The square was growing colder. The city, so warm and alive a moment ago, suddenly felt too indifferent, too vast to cradle a man on the edge of collapse. Claire's journalistic instinct whispered that this was a story, a magnificent one. But something deeper urged her to act not as a reporter, but as a human being. She crouched beside him, steadying his limp form. "You can't stay here, not like this," she murmured. "Come on, let's get you somewhere safe." Half lifting, half guiding, she helped him to his feet, her small frame dwarfed by his. Elon offered little resistance, his trust, perhaps his hope, slipping into her care. Claire led him through narrow alleys, away from the wide boulevards where cameras might feast. She brought him to her apartment, a modest refuge tucked above a quiet bookstore. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. She eased him onto her couch, draped a woolen blanket over him, and watched as his breathing deepened, finally succumbing to the weight he had tried so hard to outrun. Claire sat across from him, questions swirling but unspoken. Who was this man when no one was watching? What did he hope to find out there, wandering alone? And why did her heart ache for a stranger she should have only seen as a headline? This, she knew, was no ordinary night. And this was only the beginning. Dear viewer, if this story has touched a quiet place in your heart, I'd love for you to stay with us on this journey. Give this video a gentle like, not just to support the channel, but as a way of saying you're walking alongside us. And if you feel a spark of curiosity about where Elon's steps will lead next, I warmly invite you to subscribe. There's so much more to uncover, and I'd be grateful to have you here when the next chapter arrives. Claire Benton had always prided herself on thinking quickly under pressure, but dragging a near-unconscious man through the quiet streets of Paris was not the sort of pressure she was used to. Elon Musk's weight pressed heavily against her as she half-carried, half-guided him to her apartment, her arms trembling with the effort. He mumbled incoherently, his steps uneven, but he didn't resist. Her apartment was modest, a sunlit space tucked above an old bookstore, its walls lined with shelves of worn novels and dog-eared maps. It smelled faintly of lavender and the lingering aroma of last night's tea. Claire eased him onto her small sofa, pulled a knitted blanket over his shoulders, and watched as he sank deeper into sleep. To her, he was just another lost tourist, a man who had perhaps drunk too much or wandered too far from his hotel. His expensive suit suggested money, but the loosened collar and the raw exhaustion on his face hinted at something more human. She didn't press him with questions. He was safe now. That was enough for the moment. The next morning, Paris awoke in its usual rhythm, bakeries exhaling warm scents onto the streets, the distant clang of metro doors, the hurried shuffle of people chasing time. Claire jolted awake, realizing with a start that she was late. She scribbled a quick note in French, "Rest. I'll be back," and left it on the small table beside the couch before rushing out the door. Her office at Le Monde du Matin was already buzzing when she arrived. The newsroom hummed with the sharp clatter of keyboards and the low murmur of voices chasing stories. Her editor, Mark, barely looked up as he barked over his shoulder, "Benton, you're late. We're running with the disappearance." She frowned, slipping into her chair. Disappearance. Elon Musk, Mark said, dropping a copy of the morning's front page onto her desk. Vanished from his hotel last night. No one knows where he went. Security's in chaos. His team's in a panic. It's everywhere. Claire's heart stuttered. There, beneath the bold headline, "Elon Musk missing in Paris," was a photo from the previous day, a carefully staged image of the man now sleeping on her sofa. The color drained from her face. She flipped through the article, absorbing the frantic details. No leads, no confirmed sightings. Authorities urging calm, rumors swirling. Her mind spun, rewinding every moment from the night before. The man slumped on the bench, the weariness in his voice, the way he had leaned into her care without question. The man in her apartment was not a lost tourist. He was the missing man the world was now desperate to find. Claire's hands trembled as she folded the newspaper. This was more than chance. It was the kind of moment journalists wait their entire lives for, a story that could define a career. But instead of triumph, Claire felt the weight of responsibility settle over her. Her story was asleep on her couch, oblivious to the chaos his absence had triggered. By the time she returned home that evening, her eyes were sharp with a new awareness. She studied him carefully now, the familiar angles of his face, the subtle tension still lingering in his jaw. Elon stirred as she entered, blinking against the soft afternoon light that pooled through her lace curtains. He looked at her, his gaze clear but tinged with confusion. "Where am I?" "You're safe," she said gently, offering him a glass of water. "You were, well, you needed help. I found you on a bench." He sat up slowly, taking in his unfamiliar surroundings, then turned to her with a strange sort of plea in his voice. "I need to see the city. Not as him, just as a man." Claire's heart quickened. A man who wanted to disappear. A man desperate to live outside the suffocating machinery of his own life. She nodded, choosing her words carefully. "I could show you around if you'd like. No press. No bodyguards. Just Paris." He studied her, perhaps searching for signs of a trap. But something in her voice, or perhaps the quiet honesty in her apartment, seemed to soften his suspicion. "I'd like that," he said, almost like a boy asking for permission to play. What Elon didn't know, what Claire carefully tucked behind her warm smile, was that she had already sent a discreet message to Sophie Morel, her friend and one of the most talented photojournalists in Paris. Claire had offered her an irresistible bargain: exclusive photos of Elon Musk, unseen and unguarded. Sophie's reply was immediate. "Tell me where. I'll be there." Claire's pulse quickened. She was straddling a delicate line, a human connection on one side, professional ambition on the other. Elon insisted they stop at a small optical shop first. He emerged minutes later wearing simple, round glasses with thin frames. They suited him oddly well, softening his familiar face. If it worked for Clark Kent, he mused with a half-smile, adjusting the glasses, "It might just work for me." Claire laughed softly, a sound that surprised even herself. In that moment, he didn't seem like the world's most scrutinized man. He seemed ordinary. Perhaps that was what he was chasing. Throughout the day, Claire guided him through hidden gardens, narrow bookshops, and street markets fragrant with spices. She marveled at how free he looked as he sampled roasted chestnuts from a street vendor, as he haggled with a painter over a watercolor by the Seine. What Elon didn't see were the brief flashes of Sophie's camera from across the street, from behind a cafe window, from a passing scooter. Claire made sure the photos captured his joy, his wonder, his humanity. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting Paris in a golden haze, Claire realized something was shifting inside her. This had started as a story, but now, walking beside him, it was becoming something else entirely. They were not just reporter and subject. They were two people, each quietly escaping their own lives, if only for a day. And the day was not yet over. For the first time in years, Elon Musk tasted life without walls. The morning air was crisp as he strolled beside Claire through a bustling public square, the sun casting a soft golden sheen on the cobblestones. Street performers played delicate melodies on violins, and the warm scent of roasted nuts drifted through the air. A small ice cream cart caught his attention, its brightly colored awning standing like a cheerful invitation amidst the crowd. Without hesitation, Elon bought a simple cone, vanilla, the most unassuming choice, and savored it slowly, as though it were the most luxurious thing he'd ever tasted. The cold sweetness melted on his tongue, and a quiet smile tugged at his lips. Claire observed him, struck by how genuinely he relished the ordinary. It wasn't long before they came across a bike rental stand. Claire suggested they try something bold, something he likely hadn't done in decades. Elon grinned and nodded. Moments later, they were weaving through the busy streets of Paris on two well-worn bicycles, the wind tugging at their hair, horns blaring around them as they navigated the chaos with clumsy determination. Claire laughed as Elon wobbled dangerously close to a fruit stand, recovering just in time to avoid spectacular spill. His laughter, hearty and unguarded, filled the street. "You're terrible at this," she teased, her hazel eyes sparkling with mischief. "I'm getting the hang of it," he shot back, pedaling faster in mock competition. The city, usually a blur behind tinted car windows, unfolded around him in vivid detail. The rhythmic clatter of cafe chairs, the scent of fresh bread curling from open bakery doors, the symphony of voices. This was Paris, not from a distance, but as it truly lived. The shared moments, the near misses, the light-hearted teasing, they chipped away at the careful distance Claire had tried to maintain. He was more than her story now. He was becoming her companion in adventure. Yet still, part of her remained tethered to her purpose. As they approached the Eiffel Tower, Claire subtly brushed her hand against her bag in the prearranged signal. Across the plaza, Sophie Morel, her trusted friend, appeared like a shadow in the crowd, camera in hand, her lens quietly capturing Elon's wonder as he gazed up at the latticework of iron. Elon's gaze lingered on the tower, his voice quiet. "I've seen it 100 times, but always from a distance. It never felt real until now." Claire felt a flicker of guilt twist in her chest, but she quickly tucked it away. They continued to the Louvre, where the polished marble halls echoed their footsteps. Claire, sensing his mood lighten, led him to a gallery filled with ancient sculptures. She slipped her arm through a hollowed statue, playfully pretending her hand had vanished. "Oh no," she gasped with exaggerated panic. "My hand, it's gone forever." Elon burst into laughter, a sound so pure and surprised it startled even him. In that moment, he wasn't the man burdened by empire. He was simply a man enjoying a rare, unscripted joy. From across the hall, Sophie's camera clicked softly, her professional distance beginning to blur as she noticed Claire's affection growing more genuine with each passing hour. Later, they drifted to the Seine River, boarding a small boat that glided effortlessly through the gentle current. The low murmur of water against wood, the occasional call of a distant bird, Paris seemed to exhale here, far from the impatient rhythm of its streets. Elon leaned on the rail, his new glasses slightly askew, his expression peaceful. "I love this feeling of not being recognized, of just being." Claire sat beside him, her heart tightening as his honesty seeped into the quiet between them. "You don't get that often, do you?" she asked softly. "Never," he admitted. "Even when I'm alone, I'm not really alone. There's always someone watching, expecting, calculating. Today I feel human." Claire looked away, ashamed of the secret she carried. She had built this day around a story, her story. But now, it no longer felt like just a professional pursuit. She was documenting his freedom while quietly falling into its spell. Elon's childlike curiosity returned as they passed a street vendor selling bright bouquets of wildflowers. Without hesitation, he bought a handful and began offering individual blooms to strangers along the riverbank, a young boy, an elderly woman, a street musician. Each recipient beamed, touched by the simple, unexpected gesture. Claire watched, her throat tightening. He wasn't doing it for cameras. He wasn't doing it for applause. He was doing it simply because he could. When they reached the Arc de Triomphe, Elon settled on a nearby bench, his posture relaxed, his eyes closed, soaking in the warm afternoon breeze. Claire sat beside him, the silence between them no longer uncomfortable, but filled with quiet understanding. She thought about the article she could write, the photos Sophie had likely captured throughout the day. The story would spread like wildfire. She would be praised, promoted. It would be the kind of story that opens doors. But at what cost? She glanced at him, the world's most sought-after man, sitting in complete peace because for once he trusted someone to let him just be. Was she willing to betray that trust? To turn this day, their day, into another polished headline? Her phone vibrated softly in her bag, probably Sophie, waiting for confirmation, waiting to know whether Claire would press forward. But Claire left the phone unanswered. As the afternoon stretched toward evening, the city seemed to slow, casting everything in a soft, amber light. Their connection had deepened wordlessly, like water quietly shaping stone. And though the weight of her decision pressed upon her, Claire wasn't ready to face it. Not yet. There was still more day left to live. The music drifted across the Seine like a secret invitation. Beneath strings of warm, hanging lights, people gathered along the riverbank, dancing in loose circles, their movements unpracticed but sincere. The scent of summer air and distant lavender clung to the evening, wrapping Paris in a gentle hum of joy. Claire led Elon to the edge of the gathering, where couples swayed to the soft rhythm of an old accordion. For a moment, he hesitated, his eyes searching the crowd, as though expecting his familiar life to claw him back at any second. But then, as Claire reached for his hand, something inside him yielded. Elon stepped into the circle, his grip on her fingers steady, and allowed the music to pull him in. The steps were simple, the mood infectious. He moved clumsily at first, laughing at himself as he tried to follow the beat. Claire giggled, guiding him with patience, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder as they spun beneath the string lights. For the first time in years, Elon felt weightless. His laughter, genuine, unguarded, rose into the warm night, blending with the soft chatter and the distant splash of water against the quay. They danced until their breathing grew uneven, until the lines between strangers blurred, until the world felt, impossibly, like it belonged to them alone. Claire's playful glances soon softened into quiet pauses. The brush of her fingers against his palm lingered. Their closeness, born from adventure, now settled into something tender, something that neither of them dared to name. In that suspended moment, Elon allowed himself to believe this day could stretch forever. But life, relentless in its timing, had other plans. From the corner of the dance circle, two men in dark suits appeared, too rigid, too alert to belong among the revelers. Claire noticed them first, the sharp tilt of their heads, the urgency in their eyes as they locked onto Elon. "Your people," she whispered, panic threading through her voice. Elon's smile faltered. The agents closed in swiftly, cutting through the crowd with clinical precision. One reached out, his voice low but firm. "Sir, we need to return. Now." "I'm not ready," Elon said, his chest tightening. "We can't let this continue. Please cooperate." But Elon did not move. Claire's instincts ignited. She gripped his hand tightly, pulling him backward into the moving crowd. "Come on." The agent lunged. The music faltered as bystanders stumbled away, sensing the shift from celebration to confrontation. Elon shoved back, knocking the man off balance, and suddenly the party dissolved into chaos. Claire's heart pounded as they weaved desperately through the dancers, her fingers laced tightly with Elon's. Another agent appeared, grabbing for Claire's shoulder, but before he could tighten his grip, Sophie burst from the crowd, swinging her camera bag with surprising force. The man staggered, releasing Claire. "Run!" Sophie shouted, shoving Elon toward the narrow alley. Adrenaline roared in Claire's ears as she and Elon sprinted through the winding streets, their breaths sharp and ragged. They reached their abandoned bicycles and launched themselves onto the seats, pedaling furiously as the distant shouts of the agents echoed behind them. The night swallowed them quickly, the maze of Paris working in their favor. They rode until their legs burned, until the streets narrowed and the lights thinned. Finally, they ducked into a dark corner where the city's heartbeat quieted to a faint murmur. Chest heaving, Claire leaned against the wall, pressing her palm to her racing heart. Elon crouched nearby, sweat glistening on his brow, his glasses askew. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were their breathing and the distant pulse of the river. Claire's gaze met his, the weight of reality settling heavily between them. The spell of the day was breaking. The shadows of his life had caught up, and even the city, so vast, so unpredictable, could no longer shield him. "This can't last, can it?" Claire murmured, her voice caught somewhere between hope and resignation. Elon shook his head slowly, sadness clouding his features. "It was borrowed time, and it's running out. They walked the remaining distance to Claire's apartment in silence. The electricity of the chase had faded, replaced by something quieter, something tender and bittersweet. The streets, now empty in the early hours, seemed to echo their unspoken goodbye. When they reached her building, Claire paused at the door. "You can stay if you want. I can help you disappear a little longer." Elon's eyes softened, gratitude shining through his exhaustion. "I can't," he whispered, the words heavy with the weight of duty. "They'll find me again. And I have things I can't walk away from." Claire understood. She had always understood. But now, it hurt in ways she hadn't prepared for. "You gave me something today," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just freedom. You gave me a piece of myself I thought I'd lost." Claire's throat tightened, but she managed a small, wistful smile. "It was a good day. The best," he said quietly. Without asking, she walked him back to his hotel, her hand brushing his arm occasionally, neither of them willing to quicken their steps. The city remained hushed, as if honoring their parting. They stopped just short of the grand entrance, the quiet hum of security already pulsing nearby. Elon turned to her, his eyes saying what his words could not. There was no grand farewell, no promises, no please, only a lingering touch, a thumb brushing the back of her hand, and a final, unspoken understanding. Some moments they both knew could not follow them back into the lives they must now return to. Some moments belonged only to Paris, to the river, to the narrow streets where they had dared to live outside the edges. And as Elon disappeared into the waiting arms of his security team, Claire remained on the sidewalk, her heart both full and aching, her story forever changed. The sky was just beginning to soften, the pale blush of dawn brushing the edges of the Paris skyline as Elon Musk slipped quietly through the side entrance of the hotel. His security team, though frazzled by the events of the previous day, moved quickly, wordlessly surrounding him like a well-rehearsed machine snapping back into place. There were no questions, no scoldings, only swift, efficient movements as they ushered him toward his suite. His disappearance would be quietly buried. The schedule, on the other hand, could not. Within minutes, his personal assistant had pressed the day's itinerary into his hands. Meetings, interviews, contract signings, a parade of expectations stacked one after the other with no room to breathe. Elon glanced at the list, the weight of his responsibilities descending upon him like a heavy cloak freshly thrown across his shoulders. He felt the distinct tightening of a world he no longer fit inside, yet could never leave behind. Standing before the grand mirror in his room, he adjusted his jacket, straightened the collar, and studied the reflection that stared back. Gone was the man who had danced beneath string lights by the river. Gone was the boy who had tasted vanilla ice cream like it was his first. The man in the mirror was composed, armored, untouchable, a figure sculpted for the stage, not for the streets. With steady hands, Elon removed his glasses and tucked them into his pocket, a small, silent rebellion he wasn't yet ready to give up. Meanwhile, across the city, Claire Benton sat quietly in her modest apartment, the silence of the morning wrapping around her like a soft, familiar shawl. The echoes of yesterday lingered, his laughter, the wind on her face as they rode through crowded streets, the way his hand had lingered on hers just a moment too long. She had spent years chasing stories, chasing truth, but none had ever left her quite this still. A soft knock on the door broke her reverie. Sophie Morel stepped inside, her camera bag slung casually over her shoulder, her face alight with excitement. "I developed the photos," Sophie said, spreading them out across Claire's small table. "They're extraordinary, Claire. This is the kind of story that makes careers." Claire's eyes drifted across the images, Elon smiling, dancing, offering flowers to strangers, moving through the city not as a titan of industry, but as a man shedding the weight of the world. Sophie's voice sharpened. "You're going to publish, right? You can't walk away from this." But Claire's gaze didn't leave the photographs. She touched one softly, tracing the edges as if it might dissolve beneath her fingertips. "No," she said quietly. "I'm not going to publish." Sophie blinked, the words catching her mid-thought. Claire, this is huge. You realize what you're giving up." Claire offered a small, knowing smile. Not everything is meant to be shared. Some stories, they're too precious. They belong to the people who live them, not to the world. Sophie's lips parted to argue, but she stopped. She knew Claire well enough to recognize when her mind was settled. "I was there too, remember?" Sophie said softly, settling into a chair across from her. "I saw the way you looked at him." Claire's smile faltered, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of a photograph. "And I saw the way he looked at the city, as if he finally belonged somewhere. I won't take that from him." There was a long pause between them, one steeped in quiet respect. Sophie gathered the photos and slid them back into her bag. "All right," she said gently. "No one will see them. They'll stay with me." Claire met her gaze, gratitude flickering in her soft hazel eyes. "Thank you." Across the city, Elon stood in the hotel's grand conference room, his team buzzing around him, preparing him for the final press conference before his departure from Paris. He adjusted his cufflinks, not because he cared, but because it gave his hands something to do. The speeches were handed to him, rehearsed phrases about innovation, global partnerships, the future. But his heart was elsewhere, lost in a city where he had briefly been no one and everyone at once. He moved through the final preparations, his expression composed, his posture perfect. To the outside world, he had returned, unchanged. Claire sat on the edge of her bed, debating whether to see him again. She had told herself yesterday was enough, that it was a memory she could quietly carry forward. But her chest ached with the weight of unfinished words, of things left unsaid. Eventually, she rose, moving with quiet purpose. She pulled her hair into a loose, slightly messy bun, left a few strands framing her face, and reached for her worn brown jacket. When she stepped outside, Sophie was already waiting. "You're going," Sophie said, not asking but knowing. Claire nodded. "I just need to see him. One last time." They walked together toward the conference hall, their pace steady, their silence comfortable. When they arrived, the press conference had just begun. Elon stood at the podium, answering questions with practiced ease, his voice measured, his gaze distant. The cameras clicked rhythmically, capturing every polished gesture. Claire remained at the back, her presence unnoticed, her heart caught between pride and sadness. She didn't need to speak to him. She didn't need to disrupt the careful stage he had stepped back onto. It was enough to see him there, to know that behind the careful lines of his suit, behind the perfectly rehearsed answers, there still lived the man who had raced her through the streets of Paris. Elon's eyes, for the briefest moment, drifted across the room. Their gazes met, a flash of recognition, a silent exchange thick with memory. No words passed between them. They were not needed. Some goodbyes are quiet, woven into the spaces between heartbeats. And some stories are best left unspoken, tucked safely within the walls of two hearts that will carry them forever. The grand hall of the Hotel du Palais shimmered with the sheen of expectation. Rows of polished chairs lined the marble floor, their occupants a sea of journalists, photographers, and dignitaries, each clutching notepads, recorders, or camera lenses like weapons of precision. The room buzzed with quiet urgency, the kind of tension that settles before the arrival of someone the world believes it knows. Elon Musk was scheduled to appear. His disappearance the day before had sparked a flurry of headlines, speculation, and whispers, but this morning, the official story was simple: a man needed rest. And now he had returned. Cameras clicked in rapid bursts as Elon entered, his stride measured, his composure immaculate. Dressed in a tailored dark suit, his presence filled the room effortlessly, as though the threads of power had never loosened their grip on him. His face was calm, his expression refined, a man who had long mastered the art of appearing unshaken. Yet Claire Benton, seated near the back, could see more. From her vantage point among the reporters, she observed him carefully, noticing the almost imperceptible softness in his eyes, the brief hesitation in his step, as though some part of him had lingered behind, still dancing beneath the Parisian night sky. Their gazes crossed like a quiet ripple through a still lake, a moment delicate, private, and fleeting. In that glance, gratitude passed between them, a silent acknowledgment of the day they had shared, untouched by the eyes surrounding them. Elon's gaze lingered for the briefest second, longer than protocol would allow, before returning to the sea of flashing bulbs and raised hands. His poise never faltered. He began to speak, his voice steady and precise as he recounted the successes of his European business tour. He thanked his partners, outlined future projects, and navigated each question with the familiar cadence of corporate diplomacy. To the room, he was as they expected, polished, distant, reliable. But to Claire, there was something else threaded between his words. A softness that hadn't been there before. A faint, almost imperceptible warmth that no headline could capture. From beside her, Sophie Morel slipped an envelope into her hand. "The photos," she whispered. "You might want him to have them. Just for him." Claire's fingers tightened around the envelope as a quiet ache settled in her chest. She hadn't planned to speak to him again, not like this. Their goodbye, though unspoken, had felt complete. But the weight of those photographs now tugged at her resolve. As Elon moved seamlessly through the questions, Claire watched him with a quiet kind of admiration, not for the public figure he had become, but for the man she had come to know beneath the layers. Finally, a journalist near the front stood and asked the inevitable, "Mr. Musk, after all your travels, what did you enjoy most about Paris?" The question hung in the air, delicate and dangerous. For a heartbeat, Elon hesitated, as though searching for the version of himself that would answer. His reply was careful, yet it shimmered with hidden meaning. "The architecture," he said slowly, "the quiet streets, the humanity of the city. I appreciated being reminded that the most beautiful things are often the simplest." To the room, it was a diplomatic answer. But to Claire, it was a message meant only for her. She rose from her seat, steadying herself against the rush of nerves she hadn't expected to feel. She moved forward, her press badge granting her passage to the microphone's stand. Her voice, when it came, was calm but laced with a deeper current. Claire Benton, freelance journalist. Her introduction was deliberate, distant, just another face in the crowd. Elon's expression didn't shift, but his eyes, those soft, knowing eyes, revealed everything. "I wanted to ask," Claire continued, her words carefully chosen, "when you travel so much across continents, across industries, how do you hold on to the things that matter? How do you remember who you are when the world only ever sees what you do?" The room quieted, the question unexpected in its intimacy. Elon's lips curved into a slight, thoughtful smile, the kind that only she would recognize as real. "I think," he answered slowly, "you don't hold on. You let the right moments hold on to you. And when you find them, you keep them somewhere safe, even if no one else ever knows." Claire's throat tightened, but she managed a small nod. "Thank you, Mr. Musk." "Thank you, Ms. Benton." There was nothing more to say, and yet everything had been spoken. She returned to her seat, her heart heavy but full, the envelope still in her hand. As the press conference drew to a close, she made her decision. As Elon stepped away from the podium, his team swiftly encircling him, Claire quietly approached the side exit, timing her steps with his departure. When their paths briefly crossed in a hallway, she passed him the envelope without stopping, without ceremony. "For you," she whispered. "Only you." Elon accepted it without opening it, his fingers brushing hers for just a second too long. His parting smile, soft, almost wistful, carried the weight of everything they had shared and everything they had chosen to leave unspoken. And as he disappeared behind the closing doors, Claire knew that some stories were never meant for the world. Some stories belonged only to the people who lived them. The press conference dissolved as swiftly as it had begun. Elon Musk exited with his entourage, flanked by his security team, his personal assistant close at his side, a quiet storm of movement enveloping him. In moments, he was gone, swallowed by the machinery of his life, the carefully constructed world that waited to reclaim him. Claire Benton remained seated. The room around her stirred, journalists packing their notepads, photographers reviewing their shots, editors already drafting headlines, but she sat perfectly still, her hands resting on the envelope she had chosen not to relinquish until the very end. It was done. Their paths had crossed, and now they had parted, as if the city itself had orchestrated a fleeting chapter for them to share, one no one else would ever truly understand. Beside her, Sophie Morel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, her grip firm and familiar. "You did the right thing," Sophie said softly. "We protected something precious." Claire nodded, though her throat was tight. She slipped the envelope back into her jacket pocket, the photographs now a quiet weight against her heart. They were no longer material for publication. They had become something else entirely, a private relic, a silent testimony to a day that had already begun to fade into memory. As the final journalists trickled out, the great double doors of the press hall closed with a hushed thud, sealing the space that had briefly allowed their worlds to touch. Claire rose slowly, her footsteps echoing faintly in the now empty corridors as she made her way toward the exit. The grandeur of the building, which had felt imposing on her arrival, now seemed cavernous, almost indifferent. It was as though the city had already begun to reclaim its ordinary rhythm, unfazed by the story that had quietly unraveled within it. Stepping outside, Claire was met by the crisp brilliance of the Parisian morning. The city bustled, unaware of what had passed behind the polished walls of the hotel. The streets teemed with life, vendors arranging fresh flowers, commuters hurrying along, children clutching warm pastries in parchment sleeves. The city had not paused, not even for a heartbeat, but Claire had. She walked slowly, her pace out of step with the rush around her, allowing the rhythm of her thoughts to guide her through the familiar streets. The memory of the bike ride returned first, the thrill of weaving through crowded lanes, the laughter that echoed between them, the near collision with a fruit stand that left Elon breathless with delight. She could still feel the wind tugging at her hair, still hear the uneven hum of the bicycle wheels on cobblestones. Then came the dance. Under a canopy of string lights, his tentative steps had grown bold, his laughter spilling out freely, his hands warm and steady in hers. Claire could still feel the pulse of the music, the gentle press of his palm against her back, the electric awareness of being fully present in a moment too fragile to last. The simple meal followed, ice cream melting faster than they could eat it, street food shared without ceremony, the quiet exchange of stories that needed no embellishment. Each memory unfurled with aching clarity, each step through the city tracing an invisible thread back to him. Claire realized with quiet certainty that what she had gained could never be measured in currency or reputation. The true weight of their time together lay in its transience, in the knowledge that some stories were meant to be carried, not sold. As if sensing the tide of her thoughts, Sophie walked silently beside her, offering nothing more than a gentle pat on the back, a gesture without words, yet rich with understanding. It was all Claire needed. Together, they meandered through the streets that had become etched with his presence. Claire's eyes lingered on the benches, the bookshop windows, the street corner where he had bought wildflowers and handed them to passing strangers. The city was unchanged. The lamplights still leaned over the cobblestones, the boats still glided along the Seine, and the Eiffel Tower still stretched skyward, as it always had. Yet Claire knew, without question, that she would never see it the same way again. In the quiet spaces between breaths, she would always hear his laughter. In the golden flicker of streetlights, she would always see his silhouette moving just beyond reach. Her feet, almost unconsciously, led her toward the hotel one final time. She paused across the street, watching as his security team loaded sleek black cars as polished men in suits relayed schedules and briefings. She could have crossed. She could have slipped into the margins of his life again, if only to see him step into the car that would carry him away. But some distances were meant to remain. Claire turned away, her fingers brushing the edge of the envelope, still tucked safely inside her jacket. It no longer mattered if he saw the photographs. They were hers now, as much a part of her as the streets she had known all her life. She walked on, the morning stretching before her, the city alive with its endless, unknowing pulse. Paris would move forward. So would she. But somewhere, folded quietly within her, she would carry the memory of the day she had shared with a man who simply wanted to be ordinary. And that, she knew, would be enough. The apartment was quiet. Claire Benton sat before her desk, the soft morning light filtering through the lace curtains and warming the wooden floor beneath her feet. The familiar hum of her computer filled the silence, its screen glowing expectantly. The cursor blinked at the top of a blank document, waiting, always waiting, for the story she was meant to tell. But her fingers never touched the keys. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the window where the city moved on without hesitation, where the river still flowed, the streetcars still rattled, and the laughter of strangers still danced in the air. The story she could have written, the one that would have captured the attention of the world, remained quietly sealed within her heart, safe and untouched. There would be no headline, no byline, no photograph to mark what had passed between them. It would live only where it had always belonged, in memory. Sophie Morel, true to her word, had stored the photographs carefully, tucked them away in a box that would one day fade with time and dust. They would not become artifacts. They would not feed the insatiable appetite of public curiosity. They would simply rest, known only to the two women who had chosen to protect something rare. Claire's eyes wandered to the empty journal on her desk, its crisp pages waiting for stories that would never come. She touched the cover gently, tracing the soft leather with her fingertips, and felt no urgency to fill it. There was peace in the absence. There was peace in leaving some stories untold. She rose from her chair and moved about her apartment with the quiet rhythm of someone whose life had resumed. Assignments came and went, press briefings, interviews, editorials. Deadlines continued to pulse, but no story ever carried the same weight again. None of them touched the place within her where those fleeting hours with Elon Musk still lived, undisturbed. She walked through Paris with new eyes now. The hurried streets, the creaking cafe chairs, the worn cobblestones, they all glowed with a tenderness she hadn't seen before. She no longer rushed to capture stories in the ordinary. She paused instead, learning to simply be present, to allow the moments to breathe around her. And always, in the soft corners of her mind, Elon's smile lingered. His laughter, rare and unguarded, would echo back to her in quiet moments, when the breeze caught her hair in just the right way, when the scent of warm bread floated from an open bakery door, when the bells of passing bicycles chimed faintly in the distance. She had given him a day of freedom, and he had given her something too, a reminder that not everything needed to be recorded, not every beautiful thing needed to be shared. Far away from the Parisian streets, Elon continued his relentless march through boardrooms and innovation summits, his face reappearing on magazine covers, his voice returning to the polished cadence expected of him. His days were filled with precision, his movements rehearsed, his words carefully measured. But something had shifted within him. He often paused now, brief, quiet moments when the machinery of his life slowed just enough for memory to slip through the cracks. He would find himself staring out over a balcony in Shanghai or watching rain streak the windows of a London office, and there she would be, not in flesh, but in the vivid clarity of recollection. Claire's face would surface, her soft hazel eyes, her delicate smile, the way her laughter had broken through the armor he had carried for so long. She had asked for nothing. She had expected nothing. She had simply offered him the most precious gift, a day that belonged only to them. Their paths never crossed again. The press and the world returned to their carefully scripted expectations, and Elon continued to meet them. But within him, the memory of that day shimmered, a quiet rebellion against the version of himself the world demanded. Claire carried her own private rebellion, too. She strolled the same streets they had explored together, her steps slow and deliberate, letting the city reveal itself in new ways. She found herself returning often to the Arc de Triomphe, where she would pause, leaning against a stone railing, and listen, not with her ears, but with her heart, for the faint trace of their laughter, still alive somewhere in the folds of the afternoon air. There were no regrets, only gratitude. The story remained unwritten, but was not lost. It had settled into the quiet spaces of her life, a chapter closed yet forever alive. When friends asked her about her time covering the press conference, she simply smiled, offering the polished version the world expected. There was no need to explain what the pages of her journal would never contain. Some stories, she realized, were not meant to be told. Some stories were meant to be lived, to be cherished in their purest form, untouched by headlines, unshaped by public gaze. And in the silence that followed, in the gentle hum of her ordinary days, Claire knew that this was one story she would carry alone, not as a secret, but as a treasure. The streets of Paris stretched before Claire Benton like a living tapestry, familiar yet irrevocably altered. She walked them slowly, her hands tucked deep into her coat pockets, as if pressing herself closer to the memories that clung to the city's corners. It amazed her how quickly the day had slipped away, how something so vivid could now feel as though it belonged to another life. She had always known that time was merciless, that even the most beautiful moments dissolved into the steady rhythm of the everyday. And yet, she hadn't expected the ache to be quite so sharp. Everywhere she turned, she saw traces of him. The narrow alley where they had paused to catch their breath. The cafe terrace where he had insisted on buying her ice cream, laughing when it melted faster than they could eat it. The quiet footbridge over the Seine where they had stood, watching the sun dissolve into the river. It was as if Elon Musk still lingered in the city's air, etched into the very stones beneath her feet. Drawn by something she couldn't name, Claire found herself returning to the park bench where it had all begun, the place where she had first stumbled upon him, slumped in exhaustion, half lost to the world. The bench now sat in its usual silence, bathed in the gentle gold of the afternoon sun. But in her memory, it was alive. She could still see him there, his breathing shallow, his words barely formed, the weight of his carefully controlled life pressing him into the worn wooden slats. Claire lowered herself onto the bench, her body settling into the place where their story had quietly begun. She closed her eyes, letting the city's hum dissolve around her as she replayed their conversations, their laughter, their quiet, wordless moments that had spoken louder than anything she could have written. Did he remember too? Was he at that very moment, halfway across the world, pausing to think of her? Did the echo of their day reach him through the heavy fabric of his life? She would never know. The thought didn't sadden her, not really. Some stories were meant to live in the spaces where certainty couldn't reach. Soft footsteps approached, pulling her gently from her reverie. Sophie Morel appeared, her camera slung lazily over one shoulder, 2 cups of coffee in hand. "I figured I'd find you here," Sophie said simply, her voice carrying its usual steady warmth. Claire accepted the coffee with a small, grateful nod. They sat together in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that didn't demand to be filled. Around them, the park moved as it always did, dogs trotting alongside their owners, children chasing one another across the grass, strangers absorbed in books or quiet conversation. "It still feels like he's here," Claire said finally, her voice soft, her gaze distant. Sophie followed her line of sight to the empty bench beside them. "Maybe he is," she murmured. Claire turned the paper cup in her hands, the rising steam brushing her face. "I keep thinking about the choice I made, about walking away from the story." "You did the right thing," Sophie said, not for the first time. "It wasn't just a story," Claire admitted, her voice faltering slightly. "I thought it was at the beginning, but somewhere along the way, it became something else. Something I wasn't ready to let the world have." Sophie didn't argue. She understood. Perhaps she had always understood. The silence between them deepened, not uncomfortable, but weighted with all that had gone unsaid. Claire reached into her bag and pulled out the small bundle of photographs, candid moments, spontaneous smiles, fleeting glances that no one else had seen. She flipped through them absently, each image a frozen echo of a day that had slipped through their fingers. She lingered on one, a quiet shot of Elon laughing as he offered a flower to a passing child, his glasses slightly askew, his expression utterly unguarded. Carefully, Claire gathered the photographs and returned them to their envelope. When she arrived home later, she would place them in a small wooden box, store them among the private relics of her life, not as evidence, not as unfinished work, but as memories untold. Turning to Sophie, she offered a soft, sincere smile. "Thank you for trusting me, for protecting this, even when you didn't have to." Sophie shrugged, but her gray-blue eyes softened. Some stories are worth keeping safe, even from ourselves. Claire's chest ached with quiet gratitude. She knew what it had cost Sophie, the missed opportunities, the photographs that could have defined her career. But her friend had chosen to honor the silence instead. They rose from the bench together, walking side by side as the city unfolded around them, unchanged to the world, but forever altered to Claire. Every street corner held a trace of him now. Every breeze that tugged at her hair whispered of the freedom they had shared. The cafe chairs, the bicycle bells, the distant laughter, they all shimmered with the faintest echo of a day that belonged to neither of them now, yet belonged to them both forever. They passed the Arc de Triomphe one last time, and though the monument stood unchanged, Claire felt as though its shadow carried their laughter still, faint but stubborn, refusing to fade completely. Her life would resume. Deadlines would return. New stories would find her. But she knew, deeply, unshakably, that none would ever carry the weight of this one. Some stories, she realized as she glanced toward the sky, are not meant to be told. Some stories are meant to be lived, briefly, beautifully, and quietly folded into the pages of a life, untouched by the hands of time. Elon Musk returned to the ordered cadence of his life, but something within him refused to settle. The rhythm that had once been second nature, meetings, contracts, press conferences, carefully timed entrances and exits, now felt oddly discordant, as though he were moving to a song whose tempo no longer matched his heart. He sat through presentations and nodded at polished strategies, but the edges of his focus frayed, his thoughts wandering far from the conference tables. His advisors noticed the faint distraction in his eyes, the pauses that stretched a beat too long before his responses came. But they said nothing. They assumed fatigue, perhaps the cost of constant ambition. Elon knew better. His heart was distant because part of him was still there, on a bike weaving through Parisian streets, laughing over ice cream, standing quietly beside a woman who had asked for nothing but his presence. That day returned to him with startling clarity, playing in loops as vivid as if it had only just passed. The taste of roasted chestnuts, the feel of the cool stone rail beneath his hands at the river, the sound of Claire's soft laughter as she teased him over his clumsy cycling. The memory refused to soften with time. It sharpened, demanding to be acknowledged. When he could steal moments alone, Elon reread the scribbled notes he had jotted down in the journal Claire had quietly handed him that day. A simple, leather-bound book that had since traveled with him, tucked inside his briefcase like a secret talisman. His words were hurried and uneven, but they carried the rawness he had been too guarded to speak aloud. "I forgot how to breathe," she reminded me. "This is what freedom tastes like, ice cream melting too fast." Her silence gave me more than the loudest applause ever could. The taste of that freedom still lingered, made sharper, now that it was gone. More and more, he began slipping away from his security detail, ducking out of carefully mapped routes, vanishing briefly into the heartbeat of Paris. His team grew uneasy, but Elon offered no explanations. He sought the quiet streets, the tucked-away courtyards, the anonymous corners where life unfolded without fanfare. He wandered as he had that first night, not in defiance, but in longing. He was searching, not for places, but for her. Elon's heart pulled him toward the thought of Claire, not as a headline or a fleeting curiosity, but as someone who had held his unguarded self for a day and asked for nothing in return. The comfort he found in her presence haunted him now, like a melody he could not forget. In her apartment, Claire moved with quiet purpose, writing again, but not the story the world would have clamored to read. She wrote about moments that slipped away, about brief encounters that shimmered and vanished like sunlight on the Seine. She never named him. She never would. She guarded their day like something sacred, a page folded and tucked safely in the heart. She felt the weight of their goodbye, a tender ache that had settled into her bones, but she did not regret it. Some days, she would pause mid-sentence, her pen hovering over the page, as his smile surfaced again in her memory. She would close her eyes, feel the breeze from that last bike ride, and choose again to let the story remain hers alone. Elon, unable to contain the pull that kept drawing him back, called his security chief. "I need her address," he said, carefully neutral. "Claire Benton." But the search yielded nothing. No official records remained in the files his team could access. No address, no contact, as if the city itself had gently erased her trail, guarding her as she had once guarded him. Frustrated but undeterred, he returned to the park bench where she had first found him. He sat for long, silent stretches, the wood cool beneath his palms, his eyes scanning each passerby with a flicker of hope. But the bench remained stubbornly empty of her. He stayed day after day, as if willing the universe to conspire on his behalf. Perhaps some things couldn't be engineered. Perhaps they had to be surrendered to chance. Unbeknownst to him, on that very morning, Claire had risen early, her feet guided not by routine, but by quiet instinct. She retraced the bike route they had once shared, her hands brushing the worn handlebars of a rented bicycle, her heart thudding softly with every turn she made. The streets whispered of their day, the faded chalk markings from children's games still lingering on the sidewalks, the familiar arch of the footbridge calling to her. She hadn't expected to see him again. Sometimes she wondered if part of her had invented him, if their day had been a beautiful dream spun from the quiet corners of her longing. But the ache in her chest told her otherwise. It was chance, pure unplanned chance, that brought their paths to cross once more. She turned a quiet corner near the Seine, the early morning sun glinting off the river, and there he was. Elon. He stood across the street, as if plucked from memory, and dropped back into her life. He was dressed in simple clothes again, the thin-rimmed glasses perched on his nose, his hair tousled by the breeze. He looked up, as if pulled by an invisible thread, and their eyes met. For a breathless moment, neither moved. The world fell away. The hum of passing cars, the distant clatter of dishes from a cafe, the fluttering of pigeons on the sidewalk. All of it dissolved into silence. Elon's expression softened, overwhelmed and quietly overjoyed, as though he had spent a lifetime waiting for this very second. Claire's hand slowly drifted to her scarf, steadying herself against the tide of emotion that rose too quickly to contain. Their feet found each other in small, hesitant steps, the distance shrinking as if the city itself had conspired to bring them back to this crossing. No words were spoken. They simply stood, suspended between memory and possibility, their eyes carrying everything their lips could not. Some goodbyes, it seemed, were not meant to hold. Some stories insisted on finding their way back. For a long, uncertain moment, Elon Musk stood at the edge of the quiet street, unsure if he belonged in this chapter of her life. The memory of their day together had lived so vividly in his mind that he feared meeting her again might fracture it, that perhaps the beauty of that day had been meant to remain untouched. But there she was. Claire Benton stood just steps away, her soft hazel eyes wide in surprise, a small smile blooming on her lips before she could catch it. The chestnut waves of her hair shifted gently in the breeze, framing her delicate face in a way that made her seem both deeply familiar and impossibly distant. "You're here," she said softly, as if she were still convincing herself the sight was real. Elon stepped closer, his voice low and unsteady. "I wasn't sure you'd want me to be." Her smile didn't falter. If anything, it deepened into something tender. "I'm glad you are." He exhaled, his shoulders easing slightly, though his heart still beat against the walls of his chest. "I haven't stopped thinking about you since that day. Since you let me be free." Claire's gaze dropped briefly to the ground, her voice a quiet confession. I've replayed it too. Every morning, every street we crossed, every silly moment. I thought maybe I was the only one. They found their way back to the park bench, the same one where it had all begun. It welcomed them as if no time had passed at all, as if their laughter still lingered in the grain of the wood. They sat side by side, silence resting comfortably between them. Elon's hands fidgeted with the edge of his sleeve. I don't know what this is supposed to be. I don't have a plan, but I know I don't want it to end here. Claire tilted her head slightly, the softness in her eyes clouded by the faintest hesitation. He turned to her, his voice honest and unsure. Would you consider spending more time with me? No pretending this time. No borrowed hours. She let the question hang, the weight of it pressing against her ribs. The man sitting beside her was still Elon Musk, still tethered to a world far more complex than hers, a world of bodyguards, obligations, and expectations she had spent her life avoiding. I'm not sure how I'd fit in your world, she said, her fingers tracing the worn edge of the bench. His reply was immediate, quiet but resolute. I don't want you to fit in my world. I want to step out of it. With you. Claire searched his face, looking for the familiar armor he wore in front of cameras, the polished distance she had once written about in news articles. But she found none of it here. He was stripped of it now, his words offered with a kind of vulnerability that disarmed her. A part of her wanted to tell him no, to protect the memory of their perfect day and let it remain untouched. But the truth settled in her heart before she could deny it. She wanted to see what could come next. She wanted to see if freedom could exist not just for a fleeting moment, but in the slow unfolding of days. She smiled this time fully, as if her answer had been waiting quietly all along. All right, she said, let's see what tomorrow looks like. Relief swept over him, pulling a small, boyish grin to his lips. They rose from a bench, falling into an easy rhythm as they wandered through streets that now belonged to them in a new way. Claire pointed out the hidden bookshop where she spent long afternoons. Elon shared stories from his travels that never made the press, moments of loneliness, of wonder, of quiet defiance. There was something sweeter about this day, less hurried, less fragile. He no longer clung to the time as if it might be snatched away. He simply walked beside her, savoring the warmth of shared footsteps. Elon stopped at a small cafe buying 2 coffees, no assistants, no press, no orchestration. Just 2 people sitting at a chipped bistro table, their hands wrapped around paper cups as they talk about everything and nothing. This, he said, glancing around the small, sunlit cafe, this feels more like me than anything I've done in months. Claire smiled into her coffee. You seem lighter today. Less like you're running away. Maybe because this time, I'm walking towards something. They laughed, and the sound folded easily into the pulse of the street. Without planning it, they found themselves at the bike stand once more. Elon looked at Claire, his eyes bright with playful challenge. One more ride. She grinned. I thought you'd never ask. This time, their laughter came more freely, their balance steadier as they pedaled side by side. They wove through familiar streets, retracing old paths and discovering new ones, racing past street musicians and pausing to watch children play by the fountains. As they rounded a corner near the river, a familiar voice called out, "Hey, you two." Sophie Morel stood across the street, her camera slung over her shoulder, waving broadly with a grin that split her face. Claire's laughter burst out, unguarded and warm. "Oh no," she teased, "we've been caught." Elon smiled, slowing his bike as Sophie crossed toward them. For the first time, they met properly, no secrets, no stage distance. "Thank you," he said to Sophie, his gratitude sincere, "for protecting what you didn't have to." Sophie shrugged, her gray-blue eyes gleaming. Some stories aren't meant to be told. Some are meant to be lived. Elon nodded, understanding the weight of those words in a way he hadn't before. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Claire and Elon continued their ride, their conversations now fluid, their silences comfortable. When they reached her street, Elon paused, his gaze steady but soft. "So tomorrow?" Claire's smile was quiet, sure. "Tomorrow." And in that moment, she realized she wasn't just living a story worth telling. She was finally living a story worth keeping. Elon Musk arrived at the quiet street corner just after sunrise, his steps unhurried, his breath steady with a quiet anticipation he had not felt in years. Claire Benton was already waiting, a small, contented smile playing at her lips as she sipped from a paper cup of coffee. The morning belonged to them now, a day untouched by schedules, headlines, or the relentless tick of obligation. "Early bird," she teased, tucking a loose strand of chestnut hair behind her ear. "I didn't want to miss a second," he admitted, his smile soft, almost boyish. They began their day with familiar ease, weaving through the streets that had once been the backdrop of their borrowed freedom. This time, they didn't need to run. There was no chase, no stolen moments. It was theirs. Elon guided Claire to a small bookstore tucked between weathered stone buildings, the very one where he had bought his journal on their first day. It still smelled of ink and paper, still offered the quiet comfort of shelves heavy with forgotten stories. "I've been meaning to come back here," Elon said, running his fingers over the worn spines. Claire found his journal resting in his bag and flipped to the back page. Without asking, she borrowed a pen from the shopkeeper and carefully wrote a single line in neat, deliberate script. "For the days we choose to remember." When she handed the journal back, Elon traced her handwriting with his thumb, a small, reverent gesture. He slipped the journal back into his bag as though it were more valuable than any contract he'd ever signed. "There are places I missed last time," he said, his voice lighter now. "Places I want to see with you." So they wandered. They strolled through quiet gardens where the air smelled of damp earth and wildflowers, lingering on park benches, letting the weight of time loosen its grip. They spoke of simple things, favorite colors, half-forgotten childhood games, the comfort of small routines. Elon's footsteps slowed near a market stall where an elderly vendor displayed a collection of small wooden toys and curiosities. Elon's eyes softened as he reached for a simple, weathered model rocket. "I had one just like this," he said, his voice distant, touched by memory. "I bought it in South Africa when I was a boy. I used to believe it could take me anywhere." Claire smiled, brushing her fingertips across the faded red paint. "Maybe it did." He purchased the rocket without hesitation, cradling it in his hand as they continued their walk. It was a thread that tied him to something simpler, something that had almost slipped away. Claire led him to her favorite cafe, a place so tucked away that even the most attentive crowds passed it by. The chairs were mismatched, the pastries imperfect, but here no one noticed him. No one cared who he was. They settled into a corner table, their coffee warming their hands as the city stirred around them. Claire watched the street with quiet curiosity, letting Elon experience one of her most beloved rituals, people watching without purpose. "You could live like this, you know," she said, her gaze still on the passers-by. "Simple, unnoticed. Parallel lives. One public, one private." Elon's eyes flickered toward hers. "I don't want two lives. I want to make space in the one I have. Real space. For this." Claire didn't press him. She simply let the weight of his words settle into the air between them. Later, as the sun reached its warmest stretch, Sophie Morel found them. She grinned as she approached, her camera now resting idly at her side. "So," Sophie teased, crossing her arms with playful challenge, "did you finally find a story worth chasing?" Claire sipped her coffee and smiled, her answer quiet but certain. "It's not a story. It's a life." Sophie's expression softened, her teasing fading into genuine affection. She simply nodded and drifted away, sensing this was a day meant to remain untouched. Elon and Claire walked along the river once more, this time fully present. No masks, no borrowed hours, no pretending. The rhythm between them was easy, steady, as though they had known each other far longer than the calendar would suggest. As the afternoon light melted into a golden haze, Elon rented a small electric scooter, one just large enough for two. Claire laughed at first, unsure if he could steer it any better than the bikes. But he did. They rode slowly this time, weaving gently through the quiet streets, her arms wrapped loosely around his waist, the wind brushing their faces, the city folding around them like a familiar storybook. When they finally stopped, the sun was setting, painting the sky in soft pinks and warm golds. Elon turned to her, his gaze steady, his expression unguarded. "I don't want this to be just Paris," he said. "I don't want it to be just this city, just this season. I want to build something real, something beyond here, beyond this." Claire felt the weight of his words, not as a question, but as a quiet invitation. She looked toward the horizon, the river catching the last light of day, and then back at him. "I'd like that," she said, her voice calm but sure. "I'd like to see where this can go." And in that moment, it no longer mattered that their worlds had once seemed impossibly far apart. They had carved out a space of their own, a rhythm that belonged only to them, a day of their own, and perhaps many more to come. The invitation came quietly, without the grandeur that usually followed Elon Musk's words. They were sitting in the small hidden cafe Claire had shown him days before, their coffee cooling between them as the morning sun slipped lazily through the treetops. "Spend the weekend with me," Elon said, his voice gentle but certain. "Somewhere outside the city. Just us." Claire hesitated. The simplicity of the offer tugged at her heart, but the weight of his world loomed in the space between them. His life was rarely simple. It was a life of headlines and negotiations, of scrutiny and schedules. A life she had briefly escaped with him, but only briefly. "You know what happens when your life catches up with you," she said softly, not quite looking at him. "It always does." Elon shook his head. "This isn't about running away. I'm not asking for that. I want to carve out something real. A space where we can exist together, even if it's just a few days at a time." There was something in his voice, a quiet sincerity, that disarmed her. She realized, perhaps, that he wasn't offering her a break from his world. He was offering her a piece of his that he didn't know how to protect without her. So she agreed. They left the next morning, leaving behind the press and the narrow streets, their train winding through fields of green and gold until the city disappeared entirely from view. The countryside wrapped around them like a soft, unspoken promise. Elon had found a modest cabin by a quiet lake, far removed from the noise that usually trailed him. It wasn't the kind of place she would have imagined for him. It was simple, peaceful, perfect. The lake shimmered under the afternoon sun, and the surrounding woods whispered in the breeze, a gentle hush that settled over them as they unpacked their few belongings. There were no handlers here, no schedules. Just two people trying to find their place in a rhythm they could call their own. That evening, as they sat by the water, Elon spoke with a softness Claire had not yet heard from him. "I used to be alone a lot when I was a kid," he confessed, skipping a smooth stone across the lake's surface. "I didn't really belong anywhere. I buried myself in books, in ideas, in things that felt big enough to swallow the loneliness." Claire listened, her hazel eyes reflecting the golden light. "And did they?" "For a while," he said, smiling faintly. "But even building rockets doesn't fill every quiet space." She felt the walls between them thinning, his carefully constructed armor slipping away, not with grand gestures, but with these quiet, unguarded truths. No one had ever spoken to her like this, like she was safe enough to hold the pieces no one else saw. They cooked together that night, elbowing each other in the tiny kitchen, their laughter tumbling over the clatter of pots and pans. The rhythm was imperfect and messy, but it was theirs. They ate simply fresh bread, roasted vegetables, and the sort of shared dessert that require no ceremony. Elon's phone buzzed once, then again. Messages he would have never dared to ignore in his other life. But here, in this place carved just for them, he silenced it and tucked it away. His attention stayed with her. As the hours stretched, Claire reached into her bag and hesitantly handed him a small folder. Inside were the first pages of a manuscript, unfinished, raw, written in the quiet hours after their first day together. She had never intended to show it to him, But now it felt right. Elon read slowly, his brow softening as the story unfolded between his fingers. "You should finish this," he said quietly, closing the folder with reverence. "You should publish it. But it's us." She couldn't hide the tremble in her voice. "I know, and I'll protect it. The heart of it will stay with us. But maybe the world needs a story like this too." They spoke honestly as the night deepened, about his public life, the press that would always follow him, the parts of himself that he could not simply set aside, about the challenge of holding something private in a life that rarely allowed such things to last. Claire, her voice just above a whisper, confessed her greatest fear. "I don't want to be someone you remember between meetings. I don't want to be invisible in your life." Elon reached for her hand, his grip steady warm. "You're the only thing I can't afford to lose." The weight of his words settled between them like a vow, not loud, not showy, but true in its quietness. When the weekend drew to a close, they returned to Paris, not as people fleeing from their lives, but as two who had chosen to carry the complexity instead of hiding from it. The city welcomed them back with its usual rhythm, the hum of traffic, the scent of fresh pastries drifting from open shop doors. But the streets felt different now, less like the backdrop of something fleeting, and more like the beginning of something real. Claire, walking beside Elon as the morning unfolded, realized that she no longer wanted to let him go. Not this time. Not after knowing what it felt like to belong in a space he had carved for her, a space that could exist both in the quiet of the countryside and in the noisy corners of the city. Between two worlds, they had found one of their own. Paris welcomed them back with the same restless hum, but something had shifted. Elon Musk was no longer living in fragments. For the first time, he began to gently open the doors to the life he had always kept guarded. It started with an invitation. He asked Claire to visit his corporate offices, not as a journalist, not as an outsider, but as someone he wanted by his side. Claire accepted with quiet curiosity, though she carried an unspoken apprehension. She had seen glimpses of his world, but only from the safe distance of headlines. Now, she was walking straight into it. The building was sleek, wrapped in glass and steel, buzzing with activity. Claire moved quietly through the halls, taking in the relentless pace, the calls, the closed-door meetings. She watched Elon from the sidelines as he navigated his role, firm, precise, and always in demand. She saw the weight of it all settle on his shoulders with a quiet gravity. Every decision passed through him. Every glance was measured. His advisors were less subtle in their curiosity. Claire noticed their glances, the quiet exchanges behind half-closed doors. They didn't know what to make of her presence. Some saw her as a distraction, others as a possible complication. But none of them dared to question Elon directly. His instructions were clear. Claire was to be respected. No explanations were required. For her part, Claire did not interfere. She observed with thoughtful distance, seeing both the scale of his influence and the strain it demanded. What unsettled her most was the relentlessness of it, the constant press attention, the never-ending requests, the phone that never stayed quiet. Even when they slipped away for lunch, even when they walked briefly along the Seine, the world chased him. But Elon was not the same man who once disappeared into Parisian streets to escape it all. Now he took deliberate steps to shield Claire from that life. He controlled which meetings she attended, declined interviews that risked pulling her into the spotlight, and fiercely protected the quiet space they had carved together. One afternoon, as Sophie joined them at a tucked-away cafe, she teased Elon in her usual sharp, playful tone. "So," she grinned, "you finally started acting like a man who knows what he wants." Elon's smile was unguarded. "Ido." Sophie's eyes flicked to Claire, her approval silent but certain. The shift in Elon's priorities became more evident. He began turning down high-profile appearances, surprising his advisors. His carefully structured calendar grew holes where once there had been no space. And those gaps he filled with Claire. Claire, however, did not fold her life into his. She remained fiercely independent, continuing her journalism work, refusing to become a silent passenger in his story. She walked the careful line between their worlds, balancing deadlines with late dinners, chasing stories with quiet rides through the city. One evening, as they sat together in Claire's apartment, Elon gently slid her half-finished manuscript toward her. "Finish it," he urged, his voice soft but insistent. "The story of our first day. It's not something you need to protect anymore. It's something worth remembering." Claire hesitated, tracing the worn edge of the page. "I was afraid that telling it would ruin it, that writing it down would turn it into something fragile. Or maybe," he said, "it will keep it alive." With his encouragement, she found the courage to finish the piece, not as a veiled secret, but as a memory to honor. Meanwhile, Elon quietly arranged to purchase the bicycle they had once rented during their first adventure. It was old, weathered, but he had it carefully restored, the scratches left untouched, each one a mark of the day that had changed them both. When he presented it to Claire, she laughed, the sound full and warm. "You're sentimental," she said, her eyes shining. "Only about the right things," he replied, his smile soft. They rode together again, weaving through the streets of Paris, not as fugitives of their own lives, but as a couple who had chosen not to hide. The ride was slower now, steady, their hands brushing as they coasted side by side. Elon's security team struggled to adjust. The routines they had once controlled now shifted unpredictably, bending to his refusal to live in isolation. But over time, even they began to understand, this was not a passing indulgence. This was his life now. There were still complications. There always would be. Claire no longer believed in the fantasy of simplicity. She understood the price of being in his orbit. But some risks, she realized, were worth taking. One evening, as the sky draped itself in deep blue, they sat on the steps of the museum where they had once paused on that first day. The streets were quiet, the city's pulse steady but distant. Elon took Claire's hand, his thumb brushing gently across her knuckles. "I don't want this to be a holiday," he said, his voice low, intimate. "I don't want this to be something we remember when we go back to the lives we had before. I want this to be home." Claire met his gaze, her heart unfolding with the weight of what he was offering. Home. Not a perfect life, not an escape, but a life where the quiet moments were protected, where their story wasn't paused but lived, where the edges of his public world could make room for something private, something lasting. She smiled, her fingers tightening around his. "Then let's build it," she whispered. And with that, they crossed the threshold, no longer between two worlds, but stepping fully into one they would create together. When Elon Musk invited Claire to accompany him to a major public event in Paris, a gala attended by dignitaries, celebrities, and the full weight of international press, she hesitated. The quiet rhythm they had built together had become something precious to her, something she feared would dissolve under the scrutiny of flashing cameras and headline-chasing journalists. Elon noticed the flicker of doubt in her eyes as he extended the invitation. "Claire," he said softly, "it's time. I've spent my life keeping my worlds apart, but I don't want to anymore. I don't want to keep you in the quiet corners while the rest of me lives somewhere else." She lowered her gaze, nervously twisting the edge of her scarf between her fingers. "Are you sure?" I'm not built for that kind of attention." "I'm sure," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "I want you there, not as a guest, not as a headline, but as part of my life." His certainty gave her courage. And so, despite the knots in her stomach, she agreed. On the evening of the gala, they arrived together. The moment Elon stepped out of the car with Claire at his side, the night exploded in a storm of camera flashes. The press, always ravenous for novelty, latched onto Claire immediately. Questions flew from all directions, speculative and insistent, but Elon offered no explanation. He didn't shield her, nor did he push her forward. He simply walked with her, hand in hand, his silent message to the world clear. This was not something to be dissected or explained. This was something to be lived. Inside the grand hall, Claire's heartbeat pounded in her ears. She felt the weight of countless eyes on her, strangers trying to fit her into their narratives. But then she glanced at Elon, steady and composed, and felt a tethered calm settle over her. When it was his turn to speak, Elon stepped onto the stage with quiet authority. He was expected to talk about innovation, global markets, and the usual forward-looking proclamations. Instead, he spoke of balance. "I've spent years chasing the next horizon," he began, his voice measured, his gaze briefly sweeping over the crowd before settling on Claire. "But somewhere along the way, I realized I was building a future with no space to stand still. I was living in a world of schedules, of scale, but I forgot the weight of simple joys." His words hung in the air, surprising the room, disarming those who expected the usual corporate script. "I've learned," he continued, "that freedom isn't always found in the farthest place or the grandest achievement. Sometimes it's found sitting quietly beside someone who sees you, not the headlines, not the public figure, but simply you." The press captured every word, hungry to spin the story, but Elon's focus never wavered from Claire. His thumb brushed the back of her hand gently, an anchor amidst the swirl of attention. Claire felt her nerves loosen as his warmth steadied her, as though his calm wrapped around her like a protective shield. She wasn't invisible here. She wasn't merely tolerated. She was fully seen. Across the city, Sophie Morel watched the live coverage from her apartment, a cup of tea cooling on the table beside her. A knowing smile crept across her face as she saw Claire's fingers intertwine with Elon's on the television screen. "He did it," Sophie whispered to herself, softly proud of the quiet revolution Elon had chosen, the deliberate act of no longer living in fragments. Later that night, as they stepped out into the crisp Paris air, Elon turned to Claire, his voice low and warm. "I wanted the world to see you," he said, "but not as a curiosity or a mystery. I wanted them to see you as I do, the woman who changed my life." Her throat tightened with the weight of his sincerity. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes," he said with quiet conviction. "I did." In the following days, Claire's story was published, not as a tell-all, not as a revelation, but as a tender, anonymous piece about a single day that changed the shape of a life. She never mentioned his name. There were no photographs, no clues for the curious. It was a story about fleeting freedom, about the beauty of unnoticed moments, about the man who had simply wanted to walk through Paris as an ordinary soul. The article resonated deeply. Letters poured into the magazine's office, strangers sharing their own quiet stories, their own days that had slipped through their fingers. Yet no one suspected its true subject. No one knew that the man in the story had been the most visible person in the world. It remained theirs. That evening, Elon and Claire returned to the streets where their story had begun. They walked slowly along the Seine, the lamps casting soft golden light across the water. The city hummed around them, but their pace belonged to no one but themselves. When they reached the park bench, Claire paused, running her fingers across the worn wooden slats. It felt smaller now, but no less sacred. "This is where I found you," she said softly. Elon sat beside her, his hand finding hers once more. "No," he whispered, his voice thick with memory. "This is where I found my freedom." Claire leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder as the city unfolded in quiet waves around them. They didn't need to speak of what lay ahead, the challenges, the noise, the inevitable pressures. They had already chosen to face them. Together. Elon Musk's life did not slow down, not really. The meetings remained relentless, the projects multiplied, and the world continued to pull at him from every corner. But through it all, Claire Benton became his quiet constant, the steady rhythm beneath the noise, the place where his scattered life found gravity. Claire didn't disappear into his orbit. She carved out her own space, a life that remained fully hers. She continued writing, shaping her days around her own deadlines and long afternoons at quiet cafes. But now there was room for Elon. He didn't eclipse her. He simply became part of her rhythm. On a soft spring morning, Elon surprised her with the restored bicycle, the same one they had rented on their first day together. Its frame still bore the faintest scratches from that ride, marks they both insisted remain untouched. Claire ran her hand over the handlebars, her hazel eyes shining with memory. You kept this. I couldn't let it go, Elon said, his voice soft, almost boyish. It's not just a bike. It's us. It became a symbol, not just of where they began, but of what they chose to build, a life woven with deliberate simplicity. They planned quiet getaways now, small escapes to lakeside cabins and sunlit villages where no one asked questions. Their calendars filled with moments stolen from a noise, pockets of honest time where they could just be. Elon's security team, initially resistant, slowly adapted to the new pace he demanded. They learned to navigate the delicate balance he insisted on protecting, a life that made room for quiet breakfasts and unscheduled walks without sacrificing safety. Sophie's world folded gently into theirs as well. Claire introduced Elon to Sophie's family, her parents and siblings, warm and welcoming, untouched by the formality that usually surrounded him. They shared simple meals and loud conversations in Sophie's small apartment, where Elon was just another guest, not the center of attention. Claire's life and Elon's didn't collide. They blended, slowly, patiently. It was never forced. It was built like a careful bridge, one step at a time. Her articles, once sharp with journalistic edge, softened into something else. She began writing about the beauty of fleeting moments, about the quiet corners of life that so often go unnoticed. Her words touched people, not because they were bold or sensational, but because they were tender. Elon supported her work quietly. He never asked for credit. He didn't appear in the stories. His support came in the form of silent pride, morning coffees delivered to her desk, and the unspoken agreement that her voice would remain fully her own. Together, they revisited each place from their first day: the bookshop, the riverside, the cafe with the worn chairs. They no longer needed to hide. The city that once served as their refuge now welcomed them openly. Claire marveled at the ease of it. She hadn't vanished into his world. She hadn't lost herself to the gravitational pull of his fame. She had built a life with him, not beneath him. She was still the woman who walked the city streets alone, still the writer who chased quiet stories. Elon, for his part, found that he valued the life they had created far more than the accolades that once drove him. The peace he found sitting beside Claire, sharing a modest breakfast at their corner cafe, mattered more to him than the thunder of applause or the weight of expectations. They created new traditions, a particular cafe table that became theirs, late-night scooter rides through quiet streets, evenings spent by the river watching the lights dance on the water. The grand became small. The extraordinary became ordinary, and they chose that ordinariness again and again. The park bench, the one where Claire had first found him asleep and adrift, became their quiet ritual. They returned to it often, not out of nostalgia, but because it had become their anchor, a silent witness to their unfolding story. One evening, as the city softened into twilight, they sat there again, side by side, the rhythm of the world slowing just enough for them to hear it. Elon looked at her, his gaze steady, the weight of their journey reflected in his soft smile. "You were never just part of my holiday," he said, his voice low, warm. "You became my everyday." Claire's fingers found his, their hands resting between them on the worn wood of the bench. "I think," she said, her voice full of quiet certainty, "we chose each other." It wasn't a story defined by grand declarations or sweeping drama. It was built on small, deliberate choices, the decision to stay, to return, to find each other again in the noise. They didn't escape the complexities of his life. They chose to carry them together. And in the spaces between the obligations, between the flashing cameras and the endless meetings, they created a world of their own, a life where the quiet mattered most. Elon Musk and Claire Benton never stepped fully away from the spotlight. The truth was they couldn't. His name would always carry weight, always stir curiosity. But what they learned, what they chose, was to build a life that made room for the sacred, the quiet, and the beautifully ordinary. They created a rhythm that belonged only to them, a delicate balance between the public world that demanded so much and the private world they fiercely protected. Elon continued to lead, to innovate, to appear on the covers of magazines. But always, he made time to walk alongside Claire, to sit with her in quiet places where the pulse of life slowed, where no one asked for anything except their presence. Claire's writing flourished in this season of her life. Her words deepened, softened, and stretched into new corners. She wrote about resilience, about love that doesn't need to shout, about freedom found not in grand escapes, but in everyday choices. Her stories no longer chased headlines. They invited readers into moments of tenderness and memory, the kinds of stories that linger in the heart long after the page is turned. The bicycle, the one Elon had restored and gifted to her, stood quietly in their home, no longer just a relic of the past, but a monument to the day everything changed. It became part of their daily life, its presence a soft reminder that not all stories needed to live on paper. Some stories were written in the way two people choose each other, again and again. Sophie Morel remained part of their circle, her camera often set aside in favor of laughter and long conversations over shared meals. She never let Elon forget how much he had fought to protect this life. And she never let Claire forget how brave it was to step into it. As the months passed, Claire began teaching writing workshops, helping others find the courage to tell their own stories. She became known for her quiet guidance, her ability to draw out voices that had been silent for too long. It wasn't fame she wanted, it was connection. Sometimes, Elon would disappear from his demanding schedule just long enough to find her sitting on their park bench, waiting for him with a book in hand. He would join her there without a word, their silence speaking volumes. In those moments, they didn't speak of boardrooms or contracts or the weight of the world. They spoke of the beauty they had built, their little world, carved out of simplicity. Claire's article about their first day together, though still anonymous, took on a quiet life of its own. Readers clung to its gentle honesty, its invitation to slow down, to see each other, to choose love even when life pushes us to rush past it. No one ever connected the story to Elon, and that became part of its quiet magic. It remained untouched by fame, safe in its anonymity. Even Elon's security team, who had once bristled at the shifts in his life, began to accept his need for space, for unscheduled days, for slow mornings with Claire. They learned that protecting him also meant protecting the life he now refused to abandon. Together, Elon and Claire explored new cities, always seeking places where no one knew their names, where they could simply exist, hand in hand, without the weight of expectation. They tasted street food in Lisbon, wandered quiet markets in Kyoto, sat beneath the stars in forgotten towns where their titles held no meaning. And yet, they always returned to Paris. Paris, where their story had first unfolded like a quiet melody. Where the streets remember them, where the park bench still stood as a faithful witness to all they had become. It became a ritual, each visit marked by a return to that bench, to that place where a life had begun to reshape itself. Their love was not loud. It did not demand attention. It grew gently, like ivy tracing the walls of a quiet home, wrapping around the edges of their days with steady persistence. The bench remained. The bike remained. The story remained. But it belonged only to them. It was not for the press. It was not for the crowds. It lived in their mornings, in their shared glances, in the quiet understanding that some loves are too precious to be paraded. And in the quiet space between seasons, they chose each other. Every single day. Theirs was not the kind of story that ended in grand farewells or cinematic climaxes. It was a story that continued, written in breakfasts shared at a small cafe, in fingers brushing against each other on slow walks, in the silent promise to return to the bench that had been theirs from the start. It was a story they kept. And perhaps as you followed this journey, you felt echoes of your own life, of the loves you've chosen, the memories you've held close, the quiet places you return to in your heart. Tell me, what memory did this story stir in you? Leave it in the comments. I read each one with care and with gratitude. Your stories matter too.